The Kansas plains shimmered beneath the relentless sun, endless waves of wheat rolling like a golden sea. The horizon stretched so far that it seemed to touch the very edge of heaven, and the air was thick with dust, sweat, and the smell of hot oil. The summer of 1943 had come heavy and dry, but to the farmers of America there was no time to complain. The world was at war, and their fields had become another front line. In those days, the small towns of the Midwest, Salina, Dodge City, Wichita, were quieter than they had ever been. The laughter of young men was missing from the local diners, the grain elevators, the church pews. They had all gone to war. The letters home came from faraway names: Tunisia, Sicily, Tarawa, Bastogne. For every rifle fired on those foreign shores, there was a plow scraping the soil here at home, turning the land into an engine of victory. Eddie Grant was 17 when his older brother Jack enlisted. Jack had always been the hero, strong, confident, a natural leader. He'd gone off in his army uniform, a crisp salute and a promise: "Keep the farm running, Eddie. That's your fight now." Eddie had wanted to follow him, to wear that same uniform and see the world, but his father's words stopped him. "We need soldiers in the fields too, son. The army eats because of us." And so Eddie stayed behind. Each morning, long before the rooster crowed, he was up. The first task was always the same: checking the tractor. Oil, gas, tires, belts. Machinery had become sacred now. Every tractor, every combine, every rusted old truck was part of the war effort. New equipment was almost impossible to get. Factories were building tanks and planes, not farm tools. So every farmer learned to become a mechanic. A broken engine could mean a failed harvest, and a failed harvest could mean hungry soldiers. By the time the first light touched the horizon, Eddie was already out in the fields. The wheat stood tall and thick, swaying gently in the dawn breeze. He would watch it for a moment, his hands on his hips, feeling the weight of what it meant. Somewhere out there, men were dying for freedom. Here, he was feeding them. In town, the war posters covered every wall and shop window. Uncle Sam pointed his finger from one corner, while another poster showed a man driving a tractor with bold red letters screaming, "He fights, you work." Another one had a woman with rolled-up sleeves, holding a hoe over her shoulder and smiling defiantly. "Plant victory gardens! Feed the fight!" And they did. Across the country, people who had never farmed before turned every patch of dirt into food. City parks became potato fields. Suburban lawns became rows of beans and carrots. But in the Midwest, it was different. This wasn't a hobby, it was a mission. Eddie's mother, Ruth Grant, had aged 10 years in 2. With her husband struggling with arthritis and Jack overseas, she ran the farm like a commander. She was up before Eddie and worked beside him until sundown. When the old combine broke down, she helped pull it apart piece by piece, her hands black with grease. When ration stamps made sugar scarce, she learned to can fruit with honey. "There's nothing we can't do," she said once, wiping sweat from her brow. "If our boys can fight through hell, we can handle Kansas heat." And she was right. The government's Food for Freedom program pushed the farmers harder than ever before. The USDA sent pamphlets, quotas, and promises. They needed record yields: more wheat, more corn, more beef, more everything. The country's very survival depended on it. What amazed everyone was how America responded. The Dust Bowl had nearly destroyed the heartland just a decade earlier. Millions had fled west, the soil had turned to lifeless dust, and hope had been scarce. But now, with war pressing down, that same land roared back to life. Scientists and engineers had developed new seeds, stronger fertilizers, and better irrigation. Tractors ran day and night. Silos filled faster than they could be emptied. The farmers knew what they were part of. Every bushel of wheat wasn't just food, it was ammunition. Each sack of flour shipped overseas was a soldier's strength, a family's survival. The Lend-Lease convoys that crossed the Atlantic carried not just weapons, but grain from Kansas, milk from Wisconsin, and pork from Iowa. Eddie sometimes lay awake at night, listening to the hum of the wind outside the window, wondering where his wheat would end up. Would it feed Jack somewhere in Italy? Would it fill the bellies of the Russians fighting on the Eastern Front? Would it help the British keep standing through the bombings? He didn't know, but he worked as though every seed planted was a bullet fired against tyranny. There were moments of exhaustion, of course. Days when the tractor broke down miles from home. Days when the rain wouldn't come, when the ground cracked open like dry skin. But the war posters on the barn wall never let him forget. Don't let them go hungry. Then there were the train days. The sound of locomotives became a hymn of victory. Eddie and his neighbors would haul sacks of grain to the station, loading them into boxcars marked with bold black letters, USA, War Supplies. The train whistles echoed across the prairie, a sound that carried both pride and sorrow. They all knew what those supplies meant. Some would return as letters, some would never come back at all. As the seasons rolled by, the fields turned from green to gold, the combines roaring through the harvest under the high Kansas sun. Sweat poured, machines clattered, and the air filled with the smell of grain and diesel. There were no days off, no holidays. Even Christmas meant work, because the war did not pause. By the end of that year, the Grant farm had produced more wheat than ever before. The government sent a certificate signed by Secretary of Agriculture Claude Wickard himself, in recognition of outstanding contribution to the war effort. Eddie's mother framed it and hung it in the kitchen. Beside it, she placed a photograph of Jack in uniform. For Eddie, that framed photo was a reminder of why they worked until their hands bled. Every American farmer, from the great ranches of Texas to the dairy barns of Vermont, had become part of something vast and sacred. They were soldiers in denim, their ranks spread across 1,000 towns, their victories measured in tons of grain instead of captured ground. The newspapers called them the silent soldiers of the soil. Eddie liked that phrase. It felt right. They didn't carry rifles, but they carried the weight of the world's hunger. They didn't storm beaches, but they fought against despair. And as he stood one evening at the edge of the fields, the sunset casting long shadows across the wheat, Eddie realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Victory wasn't only won with guns. Sometimes it was won with grit, sweat, and soil. The wheat swayed gently in the wind, glowing like fire under the fading light, and Eddie whispered quietly, "Keep growing. The world's counting on us." In that moment, under the wide Kansas sky, the farm felt like the very heart of America, steady, unbroken, and strong. The soldiers were far away, but their fight was right here too, in the heartbeat of the land itself. And so the harvest went on, the golden fields of freedom stretching endlessly toward tomorrow. While the wheat of Kansas swayed like a golden tide under an open sky, an ocean away another land lay cold, gray, and hungry. The same summer of 1943 that brought sweat and harvests to America brought famine to the heart of Europe. The German Reich, once boasting of its 1,000-year empire, was beginning to eat itself alive. The propaganda posters still shouted slogans of triumph. Germany feeds the world. But behind those paper smiles, there was nothing left to eat. Bread lines stretched for blocks through the ruins of bombed-out cities. Women in threadbare coats clutched ration cards that no longer promised enough to fill a child's stomach. The black market was the only market, and hunger had become the Reich's silent executioner. The Nazis had built their empire on conquest and plunder. When their armies swept across Europe, they looted everything: grain from Ukraine, cattle from Poland, butter and cheese from France. Their so-called hunger plan was simple: feed the German soldiers and starve the conquered. Millions in Eastern Europe perished not from bullets, but from empty bowls. But greed and arrogance are poor farmers. The fields of the East that once bloomed with golden wheat now lay scorched and abandoned, churned into mud by tanks and blood. The roads were broken, the railways bombed, and the German logistics system, once the pride of the Reich, was collapsing under its own weight. Back in Berlin, officials in the Ministry of Food issued desperate memos. Reduce civilian consumption. Replace wheat flour with rye. Use sawdust filler in bread production. These words became a bureaucratic obituary for a starving nation. Even soldiers at the front began to feel it. Wehrmacht rations shrank by half. Gone were the days of sausage and black bread. Now it was thin soup and boiled turnips. Letters from the Eastern Front spoke not of victory, but of hunger. We have not eaten meat in 2 weeks. The men steal from the horses. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the American harvest thundered forward like a force of nature. The railroads clanged and steamed under the weight of food bound for war. Ships left the ports of New York, New Orleans, and San Francisco laden with corn, flour, sugar, milk powder, and Spam, that pink, salty miracle that would soon become legendary among soldiers. The United States was producing food on a scale the world had never seen before. Government economists had predicted that wartime demand would cripple the domestic supply, but they were wrong. American farms were producing more than ever. In 1943 alone, wheat output reached over 1 billion bushels. Milk, butter, and eggs broke every record. Even as the draft pulled millions of young men into uniform, the fields did not falter. In small towns from Montana to Mississippi, women stepped into boots and overalls and took to the plows. Children who had never known hunger worked with purpose beyond their years. And the mechanization of agriculture, the tractors, harvesters, and threshers mass-produced in repurposed car factories, became as vital to victory as tanks and planes. This abundance wasn't just feeding Americans. Through the Lend-Lease program, it was feeding the free world. Every sack of Kansas wheat that left Eddie Grant's town might end up in the belly of a British soldier defending London, or a Russian factory worker keeping the front lines supplied. The convoys that crossed the Atlantic carried not just bullets and bombs, but bread. Thousands of tons of food traveled each month under constant threat of German U-boats. Merchant sailors called them ships of life. When the British Royal Navy reported a successful crossing, the telegrams were brief but profound. Cargo delivered, all safe. It meant another month of life for the besieged islands, another step toward victory. In Moscow, Soviet soldiers joked that American wheat made them stronger than German steel. The Red Army was marching on bread baked from the grain of Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa. In London, children stood in line for milk sent from Wisconsin and Illinois. In China, American rice shipments kept cities from collapse. Back in Germany, the story was very different. Hitler had gambled on conquest, feeding his people. But by 1943, the Reich's conquests were nothing but ashes. The Allied bombing campaigns had gutted the transportation network. The trains that once carried looted food to Berlin now carried refugees and corpses. In cities like Hamburg, Essen, and Cologne, people began tearing up their gardens to plant vegetables. Even the proud officers of the SS quietly ordered their kitchens to water down the stew. The Nazi elite ate well, but the people suffered. A Berlin housewife named Liesel wrote in her diary, "We eat like ghosts now. Bread stretched with sawdust, no butter, no coffee, only fear." The contrast was staggering. In one half of the world, the smell of roasted corn and fresh bread filled the air. In the other, smoke and hunger hung heavy. And as the gap widened, the moral weight of the war became clearer than ever. Eddiestown sometimes received visitors, men from the War Food Administration. They'd speak in the church hall about quotas and shipments, But one evening, a colonel from Washington said something that stuck with him forever. "You may not know it, but you're starving the enemy. Every loaf you bake, every pound you ship, it's one less meal for a Nazi." That idea burned in Eddie's mind. He thought of his brother Jack, now fighting somewhere in Italy, and realized that their war efforts were intertwined. Jack's rifle and his plow were part of the same weapon. When winter came to Kansas that year, the fields went quiet, blanketed under frost. But even then, the work didn't stop. There were repairs to make, machines to maintain, animals to tend. In the evenings, the family gathered by the radio, listening to the news from Europe. Reports of German retreats, Allied advances, and then whispers of hunger spreading through the Reich. Eddie imagined gray cities where the snow fell on empty tables. He imagined soldiers gnawing on crusts of bread, while American GIs shared full rations and cigarettes. The thought filled him with grim determination. The American farmer had become the enemy of hunger, and hunger was devouring the Reich. By early 1944, the contrast had become an open wound across Europe. German propagandists tried to hide it, but reality couldn't be buried under lies. Civilians traded gold for bread, women fainted in food lines, and rumors spread that even the officers were eating less. And as Germany's plates emptied, the Allies' supplies grew richer, their morale stronger. The war was no longer just about tanks and guns. It was about who could endure, who could sustain, who could feed victory. On one bitterly cold morning, somewhere in the ruins of Ukraine, a German soldier wrote in his frozen notebook, "The Americans have endless food. Even the prisoners eat better than we do. Perhaps they will win because they are full and we are hollow." He was right. Because while the Reich's people wasted away, the farmers of America, men like Eddie, women like Ruth, children too young to understand, were doing the impossible. They were feeding the world. And with every harvest, every trainload of grain, they were tightening the invisible noose of hunger around the neck of tyranny. The war was being won not only by soldiers, but by the silent rhythm of the heartland, by the steady hum of tractors and the relentless will of those who refused to let the world starve. In the battle between freedom and fascism, between abundance and deprivation, America's soil had chosen a side, and its harvest would decide the fate of empires. The dawn of June 6, 1944, broke gray and cold over the beaches of Normandy. The sea was rough, the sky thick with smoke, and men huddled in steel landing craft, gripping their rifles and praying under their breath. But inside every one of those soldiers was a strength that had traveled thousands of miles to be there, the bread and meat of America's heartland. From the golden fields of Kansas to the dairies of Wisconsin, from the corn rows of Iowa to the ranches of Texas, the harvests of millions had been transformed into sustenance for the greatest invasion in history. It was no exaggeration when General Eisenhower said, "An army marches on its stomach." The D-Day soldiers were fed by farmers who had never seen a battlefield, yet fought one all the same. By that summer, the entire U.S. agricultural system had become a war machine, a silent, tireless engine behind the thunder of guns. From the moment Eddie Grant's family loaded grain onto rail cars bound for New Orleans, the process unfolded like clockwork. Trains carried their harvest to the ports, where dock workers filled the holds of Liberty ships with crates of flour, canned meat, milk powder, coffee, and eggs, enough to feed millions. The convoys left under armed escort, braving torpedoes and storms, each vessel a floating granary carrying the taste of home to men and ocean away. Eddie sometimes thought about those ships when he listened to the late-night radio broadcasts, the ones that mentioned food shipments arriving safely to Allied forces. He didn't need to hear his name to know his wheat was part of that message. Somewhere, his grain was becoming bread for soldiers crouched in foxholes, his family's milk feeding airmen on English runways. The thought filled him with quiet pride. And he wasn't alone. Across America, farms were producing at levels that seemed impossible. The Department of Agriculture reported record yields, even though 5 million farmhands had gone to war. How? By sheer willpower, ingenuity, and a refusal to fail. Farm women became legends in those years. Eddie's mother, Ruth, like thousands of others, rose before sunrise, milked cows, plowed fields, repaired engines, and then came inside to manage ration books and taxes. She did it all without complaint. "The boys overseas don't stop," she'd say, "so neither can we." Her hands, once soft, grew cracked and strong, her face tanned from endless days beneath the sun. And beyond the family farms, there were the workers of the Victory Gardens, city dwellers who turned backyards, rooftops, and parks into miniature fields. They grew beans, potatoes, lettuce, and carrots by the millions of pounds. Housewives canned fruit and vegetables through the night while children collected scrap metal by day. In every American home, the war was personal. But nowhere was that spirit more tangible than in the food shipments that sustained the soldiers. Each ration box, the C ration or K ration, carried more than calories. It carried the essence of home. Inside were biscuits, chocolate, tinned meat, powdered coffee, and small letters of comfort from the manufacturers, packed in the USA. Soldiers would open those boxes and taste the farm fields they came from. Spam became the symbol of survival. Soldiers joked, cursed, and praised it in equal measure. Fried, boiled, baked, it was there at every meal. Some hated it, others swore by it, but all of them knew it meant one thing: America had their backs. When Eddie's brother Jack wrote home after the Normandy landings, his letter was smudged with mud and smoke, but alive with gratitude. "You wouldn't believe it, Ed. The stuff you folks send keeps us standing. We've been living on coffee, biscuits, and Spam for weeks, and I swear I can still taste Kansas wheat in the bread the field cooks make. We gave a French family a bag of flour last night. The old woman cried like we'd given her gold." Jack's words spread around the small Kansas town like wildfire. In the church, the congregation passed the letter from hand to hand. People wept and smiled all at once. The pastor read it aloud from the pulpit that Sunday. "The Lord feeds the world through the hands that work the soil." Those words carried power. They reminded everyone why the work mattered, why the blisters, the rationing, the exhaustion were all worth it. Every American farmer became part of something cosmic and sacred, the sustenance of freedom itself. As the Allied armies pushed deeper into France, they carried their food with them. Convoys of trucks, Red Ball Express they called them, rolled day and night from the beaches to the front, carrying ammunition and food alike. On those muddy French roads, a quarter of the cargo was always rations. Fuel fed machines, but food fed men, and the soldiers who ate well fought well. In liberated villages, the contrast between American abundance and European hunger was stark. The French and Belgians had survived on scraps for years. When the Allies arrived, they brought not just freedom, but sustenance. Children who hadn't tasted butter since 1940 licked it from their fingers. Soldiers shared their rations, their chocolate bars, their canned milk. An old woman in Normandy told a journalist, "The Americans brought the sun back with them, and the bread." Even the German prisoners of war, captured and weary, looked in disbelief at the meals they were given: hot soup, fresh bread, sometimes meat. Some of them wept when they ate. The irony was not lost on anyone. The army that had starved half of Europe was now being fed by the nation it sought to destroy. Back home, Eddie worked through the autumn harvest, long after dark. The radio in the kitchen crackled with reports of Allied advances. Paris liberated, the Germans retreating. Ruth listened while sewing patches into work gloves. She rarely smiled those days, but every time she heard the word advance, she'd whisper, "They're eating well then." The Grant farm became a symbol in their county. The local paper ran a story titled, "Our Wheat Feeds the Front." They photographed Eddie and his mother beside their tractor, smiling awkwardly beneath a banner that read, "Food for Freedom." Eddie didn't think of himself as a hero. He just worked, because he knew that if the soldiers stopped eating, the fighting would stop too. The government understood this truth deeply. In Washington, planners said the war was a battle of logistics and calories. Food shipments became as vital as ammunition. The Army Quartermaster Corps called it the supply of spirit. The scientists even studied how to make rations lighter, tastier, more energizing. Every crumb was planned, every calorie accounted for. The scale of it was staggering. Between 1942 and 1945, America sent over 50 million tons of food overseas, enough to feed 100 million people for a year. The ships carrying those supplies were so constant that German submarines began calling them the bread fleets. And still, the farmers worked. Even as exhaustion crept into their bones, even when storms ruined half the crops, they planted again, because they had to. By late 1944, the Allies had pushed into Belgium. The winter was bitter, the fighting fierce. The men at the front shivered in foxholes, dreaming of home, of hot bread and corn stew, of milk and coffee. They didn't know it, but back in Kansas, Ruth Grant was baking bread on Christmas Eve, just as she always had, and whispering a prayer for her sons and for all the soldiers who ate what her land had given. When the family sat down that night, Eddie looked out the frosted window toward the dark, silent fields. Snow covered the stubble of the last harvest, and for a moment he could almost hear the echo of engines, the trains, the ships, the convoys, all carrying the fruits of their labor across the world. He realized then that the war wasn't fought in just one place. It wasn't fought only on beaches or in cities. It was fought everywhere. In the mud of Normandy, in the kitchens of small-town America, in the hands that sowed, harvested, and loaded the grain. And as long as those hands kept working, the soldiers would keep fighting, and the world would keep believing that freedom could be fed, one loaf at a time. For the farmers of America, that knowledge was enough. Their sweat was victory, their harvests were hope. And though no medals would ever hang on their chests, the armies of democracy marched because they had made sure no man went hungry on the road to liberation. By December of 1944, the war had turned cruel again. The Allies had liberated France, reached Belgium, and stood at the edge of Germany's dark forests. But winter struck with a vengeance. The cold came down like a hammer, freezing rivers, turning mud to iron, and locking men and machines alike in a frost-bitten struggle for survival. It was the kind of cold that killed as surely as bullets, and on both sides of the line, hunger became a second enemy. For the Germans, that winter marked the beginning of the end. Their empire, once drunk on conquest, was starving to death. Cities lay in ruins, supply trains had stopped running, cows and horses were eaten long ago. Bread was made from sawdust and weeds, soup from melted snow and scraps of bone. Children in Berlin fought over potato peels in the gutters. Even the soldiers on the front received little more than thin gruel and half-rotten bread. The once mighty Wehrmacht, stretched and broken, was crumbling from the inside out. But across the frozen front lines, the Americans endured, fed by a lifeline that stretched all the way back to the farms of Kansas, Iowa, and Nebraska. The same grain harvested under the summer sun now fed men huddled in foxholes under the pale light of a European winter. Barrels of flour, tins of lard, crates of powdered milk and coffee, all moved through the Red Ball Express and its successors, trucks rolling day and night despite snow and shellfire. When the Germans launched their desperate counterattack through the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, the skies were gray, the forests were shrouded in fog, and the Allied soldiers found themselves surrounded, freezing, and low on supplies. Yet even then, the farmers of America fought beside them in spirit. In Kansas, the Grant family was still at it, Eddie worked through December despite the biting wind, his breath turning to frost in the dark. The radio in the barn crackled with grim reports. Heavy fighting in Belgium. Bastogne surrounded. Ruth paused in her milking, hands trembling on the cold metal pail. "Those boys need food more than ever," she said, her voice low and steady. "We'll send it." And they did. America sent everything it could. Planes roared across the Atlantic, filled with ration crates and fuel drums. Supply lines were stretched to the limit, but they never broke. In Bastogne, when the 101st Airborne Division was cut off, their salvation came not only from General Patton's tanks, but from the skies above. Parachutes blossomed against the gray clouds, carrying ammunition, medical kits, and rations. Small boxes marked U.S. Army, packed in Chicago, Illinois. Soldiers ripped them open with trembling hands, finding canned beef, biscuits, coffee, and chocolate bars, calories that meant the difference between holding the line or freezing to death. Those rations were the product of millions of unseen hands. Eddie's wheat, Ruth's milk, the cattle from Texas ranches, the sugar from Louisiana fields, all of it converged on Europe in a miracle of logistics and sacrifice. It was no exaggeration to say that food had become a weapon, and America wielded it with unmatched precision. The German army, by contrast, was starving. The Reich's agricultural heartlands, Ukraine, Poland, and Hungary, were either scorched, captured, or overrun. Allied bombers had shattered the railways, and what little food was left went to the elite and the SS. Civilians in the cities were left to die. Reports from the Eastern Front told of soldiers boiling leather boots for sustenance. Entire units surrendered just to eat. Hunger gnawed through the German ranks faster than bullets ever could. In Washington, a general remarked to the press, "Hitler's empire is dying on an empty stomach." That winter, the contrast between the two sides became the measure of victory itself. While the German people shivered in darkness, the Allied front lines were sustained by a flow of warmth and sustenance. American coffee, American bread, American meat. Food was morale, and morale was survival. In Bastogne, Sergeant Jack Grant, Eddie's brother, was among those surrounded paratroopers. His letter, written on a scrap of ration box, reached home months later. It read, "We held out for days with almost nothing left. Snow up to the knees, shells day and night. When those supply planes came, we tore into the rations like wolves. I swear I could smell home when I opened that can of beef. Kansas beef, maybe yours, Eddie. It kept me alive. Tell Ma that her work fed us through hell itself." Ruth read the letter aloud at the church gathering, her voice trembling but proud. The people bowed their heads, not in mourning, but in reverence. They understood then that their harvests were not just grain. They were lifelines, threads binding the farm fields of America to the frozen trenches of Europe. When the snow finally melted in early 1945, the tide of war shifted for good. The Allied armies broke through the Siegfried Line and poured into Germany. They found a land hollowed out by hunger. Civilians begged for bread. Children stared at the soldiers with hollow eyes. American troops, horrified, shared their rations, passing out chocolate and canned milk, biscuits and corned beef. For many Germans, the first full meal they'd eaten in months came from the very men they'd been taught to hate. The irony was bitter and poetic. The Reich that sought to starve nations into submission had been starved itself, while the nation of farmers and freemen had fed both its army and, eventually, its enemies. Eddie heard about the crossing of the Rhine on the radio that spring. He stood in the barn doorway as the announcer spoke of Allied victory at Remagen. The last snow was melting, and the fields were soft again. Soon he'd be planting. Another year, another crop. The war might end soon, they said, but the world would still need to eat. He thought of his brother, of the soldiers, of the millions overseas who had lived because of what they grew here. "We're not just farmers," he murmured. "We're fighters. Only our weapons are plows and seeds." The thought settled deep in his chest. The war had taught him something profound, that strength wasn't only in steel or gunfire. It was in the steady hands that worked the soil, the quiet hearts that refused to yield to hunger, the unbroken will to feed the living and outlast the destroyers. And as Germany's cities burned and its army starved, America's fields stood ready for another harvest, green, full, and defiant. The farmers didn't celebrate, they didn't boast, they simply kept working, knowing that while others fought to end the war, they had fought to make victory possible. In the end, it wasn't just bullets that broke the Reich. It was the steady, relentless rhythm of American abundance, the plow that never stopped, the bread that never ran out, the spirit that refused to let the world starve. The winter that broke the Reich was won by the warmth of 1,000,000 kitchens, by the smoke from 1,000 barns, and by the heartbeat of a nation that believed feeding freedom was the noblest fight of all.